still. 40 Thieves Retold. A tale in the romance, a medieval fairy tale series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. These figures can't be right. Are you sure, Peter? I'm going to check them over again. Peter pulled the ledger out of Mithra's hands. Yes, they're correct. Father is going to be delighted. This month has to be the most profitable one he's ever known. War is good for business, contrary to anything those grumbling old men say in Rialto. Father was a wise man to leave his family behind and set up here. I would never have been born, because younger brothers aren't allowed to marry and have children, and you would be forced to take an apprenticeship under your sour old uncle. I bless whatever prophet, false or otherwise, who persuaded the Seljuk army to attack Edessa and leave us here at Doralium as the largest city left trading with Rialto. He jumped to his feet and spread his arms wide. This war will make our fortunes, Mithra. And to celebrate, I'm taking you to dinner. Mithra could not refuse such a generous offer, for while they might be fellow apprentices at present, Peter stood to inherit all of his father's substantial merchant business one day, and Mithra's father was a woodcutter whose most valuable possessions were the 3 donkeys and a handcart he used to collect firewood every day. Not for the first time, Mithra wondered why his father had apprenticed him to a successful merchant like Simon, when he'd never have the money to buy trade goods to sell at a profit, like Simon or Mithra's uncle Kasim. Unless Mithra married a girl with a large dowry, as Kasim had. But Mithra's heart would not allow him to do something so mercenary. His parents had married for love, and Mithra meant to do the same, if the girl of his heart's desire would have him. Speaking of which, there she is, Peter said, gesturing toward the counter. Kagri blushed prettily at something her customer had said, then tugged at her veil to cover a curl which had escaped. Mithra had a sudden vision of her curls all escaping at once, reaching for him and then twining about him like serpents, before bringing him to her as an offering. One look from her deep dark eyes would hypnotize him, so he felt no need to struggle out of her snare, and he would happily serve her all his days. It was as though one of the ancient goddesses had been made mortal, and forced to hand out bountiful trays of bread to the descendants of her former worshippers. Wipe your mouth, you're drooling again, Peter hissed. Mithra swiped his sleeve across his face, only to find it dry. He shot a hurt look that only made Peter grin wider. I can't blame you. Lecham's bakery has both the sweetest and the most savory delights in the whole city. At another look from Mithra, Peter added, I'm only talking about the food. You're the one who thinks Lecham's daughter is sweeter than any pastry. My father has some Rialto lady lined up to marry me, who will likely look elsewhere if she knows I even looked at another woman before I beheld her. To hear father tell it, Rialto ladies are so jealous they should all wear green. Mithra managed a smile, but he didn't feel it. The famed city of Rialto was half a world away, the necessary gateway to trade in the north, but he would never reach it if he married for love, let alone see its ladies. But winning Kagri as his wife would surely be worth it. I will miss the food from here. The north does not have the same spices, the man in front of them lamented. So take some with you. Some to trade, some to be added to your food, and use your profits from the voyage to buy more when you return, his companion said. The first man shook his head. I fear it will not be safe to return. Why not? Has your mind become so addled you're now believing stories about sea monsters? Or the ones about girls who sit beside the northern sea and sing up storms? Sailors' tales, all of them, and not a drop of truth to be found. 'Tis not imaginary monsters I fear, but stories from the south. Did you not hear? The Seljuk army is headed here next. They mean to drive all Crusaders back into the north, and take their land for their own. A third man chimed in, then we close the gates and prove why the ancients built a fort here in the first place. Doralium has never been taken by an enemy, and it will not be conquered now. This city has stood for more than 2,000 years, and may it stand for 2,000 more." A ragged cheer went up at these words, but it died away quickly. The last time two armies had met on the plains outside the city, the Crusaders had beaten the Seljuks, and though more than 50 years had passed, the Seljuks had no intention of forgiving the Crusaders' descendants for it. The stories of atrocities the Crusaders committed when they reached what they called the Holy City, thousands of citizens killed or sold into slavery, were mirrored by the tales of what the Seljuks had done to Edessa. Doralium was a prosperous city where people of various different faiths lived in relative peace. It was this delicate balance that allowed the city to thrive as it did. "The Crusaders will come and save the city again," Peter said. "They have undoubtedly heard word of what happened in Edessa, and are building an army to take the city back even as we speak. If both armies meet outside Doralium again, we will be able to cheer them from the walls." Kagri's eyes grew wide. "They would truly fight to defend us, right outside the city walls?" Her hands flew to her heart as her eyelashes fluttered. "Oh, I could not bear to watch. I would be far too frightened. I'm sure one of our brave defenders on the walls would be willing to hold your hand, to bolster your courage with his own. Right, Mithra?" Peter dug his elbow painfully into Mithra's ribs. Mithra opened his mouth but no sound came out. By all that was holy, she was so beautiful, she stole his very breath away. "If you were there, I might be able to bear it," Kagri breathed. But her eyes were on Peter, not Mithra. A voice behind Mithra shouted, "It's the Seljuks that would save us from the Crusaders. Last time they came, they slaughtered whole cities and ate the babies. What else can you expect from northern barbarians?" "Crusaders are not cannibals," Peter burst out. "They are holy knights." The argument raged hotly as Mithra took their meal and carried it outside, following Peter and the other shouting men into the street. Blows were exchanged, but it was not long before the fight broke up, with little more than bruises and a few bloodied knuckles and noses. This was what passed for peace in Doralium, and Mithra could only hope it lasted. Peter pinched his still bleeding nose in his handkerchief. "So what are you going to do to prepare for this war?" he asked thickly. Pray that war would not venture inside the city walls, probably, Mithra thought but did not say. For either army might kill them all. "Come on, Mithra, this war will make all our fortunes. Maybe even make you enough so that Lechem will come looking for you to beg you to marry his daughter. What will you do to profit from the coming war?" Peter pressed. Mithra thought for a moment, as he bit into his meat-filled pastry. He suppressed a moan at how good it tasted. With Kagri as his wife, he would eat like a king. But in order to win her and her father's permission, he would need a plan. He closed his eyes. "When the armies come, the city will shut the gates. If there is a siege, we will run short of firewood, for no one will dare cross a battlefield to cut wood. So father and I need to fill our storerooms with all the wood we can before they arrive." Peter nodded. "After the battle is won, there will be funeral pyres too, don't forget. And both our families should buy good stores of food before the prices go up, in case there is a siege. If not, we can always sell them as supplies to the soldiers. We should take inventory of what food and drink your father has in his warehouses, and whether it can be sold at a higher profit here than shipping it north. The Crusaders will want the wine we received last week. I wonder if we'll get another shipment before the army arrives." They headed back to Peter's house, discussing plans for the coming war as if it was nothing more than another commercial opportunity. And perhaps it was. But why did the pastry in Mithra's belly insist on churning like the sea in a storm? One thing Mithra did know, whoever came to the city, whether Crusaders or Seljuks or both, the coming battle would change his life forever. 2. The first riders arrived shortly after dawn, and the rest followed like a biblical flood that refused to be stopped. Melisende watched them from the top of the keep, and even when she was called down to dinner, still the river of knights marched through her head, banners flying, proclaiming to heaven itself that they would avenge her. She longed to march with them. "Is the meat particularly good today?" Father asked. "Or are your thoughts not on your food at all?" She blinked, focusing on her almost empty trencher. She could not remember tasting her dinner at all. No matter. Crusaders must be the most saintly knights in Christendom, Melisende said dreamily. Her brother simply stared at her, as though it wounded him that she didn't think he was as good as them. Poor Godfrey. She continued, "I'm surprised you aren't going to join them, now you're a knight, Godfrey. Isn't knighthood all about honor? Traveling so far from home to lay down your very life to save the holy city, so honorable you cannot help but be named a saint. If Godfrey went, then surely her father would agree to let her go." It was said that a king and queen were leading their people in this crusade. Her father could hardly object to his own daughter going if it was suitable for queens. But father frowned. More like the least saintly. Though I have no doubt Godfrey earned his knighthood with honor, the truth of knighthood is little more than being able to sit upon a horse without falling off, and knowing one end of a sword from the other. Most of them have only taken up the cross for the glory of it, or the promised pardon of all their sins. They are men who are not heroes at home, or who have no hope of heaven without a good deed so great, it erases everything else they have done. Younger sons and troublemakers, those their fathers would not miss if they do not return. Unlike my sons, who are very much needed here at home. He signaled for a servant to refill his wine cup. I am delighted that none of your brothers have decided to join this fool scheme. Melisende's heart sank. Godfrey was nothing if not an obedient son. Especially after he'd somehow made a mess of trade negotiations in Rialto. No one would tell her the details about what he'd done, but from the whispers she'd heard, it had something to do with someone's daughter. She knew it couldn't have been that bad, knightly Godfrey wouldn't dishonor a lady, but perhaps he'd managed to offend her somehow. Most likely by refusing to kiss or touch her, if the stories she'd heard about Rialto women were true. I'm sure my brothers will find plenty of other foolish things to do instead, Melisende said sweetly. Your brothers are not foolish. They might make mistakes occasionally, but none of them are foolish, father said. Then why hasn't Godfrey returned to Rialto when we all know how much he longs to? She asked. From her father's shocked expression, she decided her arrow had struck its mark. Finally, someone would tell her what he'd done. Godfrey's trip to Rialto was ill-timed is all, and the reason he hasn't returned is nothing to do with anything he did. Godfrey knows all too well why this crusade is foolishness from start to finish, as well as what kind of men will form the bulk of that army. Stop talking in riddles, father. I'm no longer a child, and it won't be long before I am old enough to be mistress of my own destiny. What happened? Godfrey, tell her. But her brother's eyes were down on his food, his thoughts as base as the horses he loved so much. Sometimes she wondered if his mind was addled, he seemed to think so slowly. Godfrey. Godfrey blinked, finally looking up to meet father's gaze. Yes? Tell your sister what the crusading army has done. Her heart sank again. She didn't care about the Crusaders, she wanted to know about Rialto. And if neither of them was going to tell her, then she did not need to listen to them anymore. When Godfrey finished talking, he excused himself to check on the horses, and Melisende took that as her opportunity to leave as well. Yet when she reached the top of the keep, the last of the Crusaders were gone, likely into the valley and the town below. If she wanted to see them again before they left, she'd have to follow them down, or climb up to St. Michael's Spire, the watchtower that stood on the hill between Father's Keep and the valley. Whatever direction she chose, she would definitely need a warm cloak tonight. Which meant a detour to her chamber to fetch one, before she had to decide. 3. When Mithra reached home, he found it empty. His father was evidently using the last few hours of daylight to cut as much wood as possible. His was a good example to follow, and Mithra was nothing if not a dutiful son. Mithra dug out the old handcart that his father had used before he'd become the proud owner of first one, then two, and now 3 donkeys, all of which were out working with him right now. Mithra might not have time for a full day's work, but he'd probably manage to fill the handcart before it was too dark to see and the guards shut the city gates. He headed down to the bend in the river, hoping to find some trees washed down by the recent rains. Luck was with him today. The sodden branches cleaved to his axe like willing lovers. Like he hoped Kagri would when she became his wife. He couldn't imagine her being anything but eager. She always had such a ready smile, always willing to get whatever a customer wanted. That kind of willingness in a wife, wanting to be bedded whenever he wished. Why, it was the kind of happiness a man could only dream of. Mithra didn't dare dream for long, for dreaming wasn't doing, and he wouldn't have a wife at all until he had the kind of wealth that made wooing a wife a worthwhile pastime. So he hacked and he stacked, until he'd reduced a goodly bunch of branches into a cartload of firewood to sell, once it had dried out. He estimated there was at least another cartload left, but he could return in the morning for that, before he was expected at Simon's shop. It wasn't a fortune yet, but it was a start, Mithra told himself as he trudged home with the weight of the handcart trundling along behind him. He'd need a lot more before father's storerooms were full. He could only hope both armies held off for as long as possible. 4. Melisende waited until it was dark before stealing down the servants' stairs. The house had been silent for some time, so if she was quick and quiet, no one would be the wiser until morning. But luck was not with her tonight, for she ran headlong into a solid form headed up the narrow stair. Between the definitely masculine exclamation and his horsey smell, she knew she'd found no servant. "Godfrey! What are you doing here? Looming out of the darkness like that, you nearly made me scream and wake the whole house," she said. "I'm going to bed." He eyed her. "Where are you going?" It was on the tip of her tongue to tell him she was merely going down to the kitchen, to fetch something to help her sleep. But not even Godfrey was stupid enough to believe she'd wear a cloak to the kitchen. She could lie and say she'd been summoned to town to help someone, for she was the best healer the town had, but if by some miracle he divined her true purpose for going to town, he would try to stop her. "If you don't tell me, I'll be forced to tell father and he'll send men out to bring you back," Godfrey warned. "Oh, don't tell father," she burst out. She grasped his arm with both hands. "Swear you will not tell father and I will tell you." "Are you meeting a lover?" he demanded. Trust a man to think of something so silly. As if she would allow one of the boys in town to so much as touch her. "Swear to me, Godfrey, or I shall tell you nothing." Long he looked at her until finally he gave in, as she knew he would. "Very well. I swear I shall not tell father." She nodded. "I am going up to St. Michael's spire." There would be little to see in the darkness, so before he could ask why, she added, "To watch the army march out on the morrow." Let him think she would walk up the hill to the watchtower slowly, arriving in time see the dawn. While her other brothers might suspect her talents, she was certain Godfrey did not know about them. He nodded as if he understood, and she breathed an inward sigh of relief. "Would you like me to come with you to protect you on the road?" Godfrey asked. She choked back a laugh. "Of course not. With your big boots clomping along beside me, everyone from the castle to the town will know there's someone on the road alone, ripe for robbing. If I go alone, no one will even know I was there." He hung his head and she felt bad for bringing up his shortcomings. Heaven knew he had a good heart and plenty of courage, even if his wits worked a little slower than most. "As you wish," he said. He headed up the stairs, turning sideways to squeeze past her. No, she could not let them part so. Though she might change her mind, she would regret this moment if the plan she had begun to form came to fruition. Godfrey. He stopped and turned. She took a deep breath. You're a good and honorable knight, but you cannot protect everyone. We both know my fate will take me far from here. To the Holy Land, she wanted to say, but she could not, for he'd surely stop her. Safe journey, he said, resuming his ascent. She smiled in the dark. He only meant to the spire, not all the way to the Holy Land, but still he wished her well. You too, brother, she said softly as she headed out to meet her fate. 5. They're here, a small boy shouted as he ran past Simon's shop. Both Peter's and Mithra's ears pricked up. There was no need to ask who. The whole city had been humming with rumors about how close or far away the Seljuk army were. Go and see what the fuss is about, Simon said, shooing the young men out into the street. Last to reach the walls has to sweep out the shop. Peter called over his shoulder as he set off at a run. Mithra laughed and followed. They wove through crowded streets, dodging other, equally curious citizens, until they reached the wall at practically the same moment. While others queued to get through the gates, Peter pointed at the steps leading up, and led the way to the top of the walls, where several guards stood watching. No need to ask where the army was coming from, for all eyes were fixed on a distant dust cloud. A cloud that grew larger even as they watched. There must be hundreds of them, Peter breathed. Thousands, one of the guards corrected. When finally the shapes of men on horseback emerged from the cloud, Mithra began to believe him. Rank upon rank, they rode out, heading for Doralium, only to stop less than a mile from the gate. What are they doing? Peter asked. They were milling about by the river, much like the wives waiting outside Lecham's bakery each morning before it opened. They're waiting, a guard said. For what? But no one had an answer, until a man the others appeared to defer to, starting waving his arms in a determined fashion, and his men moved to where he'd directed them. Close the gates, someone shouted, and the rumble of the gates moving into place thrummed through their feet. On the plain below, the army didn't move into some sort of attacking formation, as Mithra had expected. Instead, most of the men dismounted and began to make camp. Peter raced home to tell his father the news, while Mithra stayed to watch. He'd heard tales of the massive fortifications the ancients had constructed when besieging cities, and he had to admit he was curious to see how such things were done. He stayed standing on the walls until it was too dark to see, but all he saw of the camp were cook fires dotting the plain. When morning came, it seemed a siege or even some sort of fortification were not part of the army's plan. They'd settled en masse beside the river, with no intention of attacking the city. Consequently, by the time Mithra reached the city gates with his handcart, they were already open, and he wasn't the only one heading out about his business. Now he'd cleared the riverbanks, he had to move deeper into the forest to collect firewood, but the wood wasn't as wet, so it was easier to haul the cart home when he was done. The sun was high in the sky by the time he emerged from the woods, and he had to hurry back or risk being late to work. When he reached Simon's shop, Mithra was surprised to find it wasn't open yet. He'd been apprenticed here for long enough to manage the shop by himself though, so he opened the doors and pasted what he hoped was a helpful smile on his face, for the streets were full of soldiers and citizens doing brisk business that neither Peter or Simon would want to miss out on. When the sun set, he closed the shop and set off for Simon's house to see why no one had come to the bazaar that day. With him, he lugged a clinking bag of the day's takings, which he planned to proudly present to Master Simon as proof that he'd successfully completed his apprenticeship. 6. Out the side door, following the wall around to the gate until she reached the road, and Melisende was free. Moonlight illuminated her path, setting her cloak aglow. It was a sign, she decided. Definitely a divine one. She was doing the right thing. Melisende bit her lip, tasting the magic that flowed through her veins, and began to run. Trees and fields flew past, while the road was firm beneath her boots. Her brothers would never know the sheer exhilaration of this kind of speed, not even on Pegasus, Godfrey's favorite horse, at full gallop. Godfrey did not know that she'd raced his horse many a time, and the mare had never won a race. Not that the mare had minded, she'd loved to run almost as much as Melisende. The road forked ahead, leading down to the town or up to St. Michael's spire. She paused for a moment, looking up. She could ascend the hill and look down on the army from the isolation of the high tower, as she'd said she would, or she could head down into the thick of things and become part of the wondrous undertaking that was a crusade. She had stood apart long enough. Melisende turned toward the town, only to find someone running toward her. The girl's panting breaths were louder than the patter of her footsteps on the road. The girl slowed to a stop, then doubled over to catch her breath. "Lady Melisende? What are you doing here? It is not safe, not with the army encamped just outside town." It was safe enough when you moved too swiftly to see. Not that Melisende intended to share her secret with one of the village girls. She knew the voice, but Melisende squinted at the girl's face. "Jella?" she asked. "Yes," Jella wheezed. "What are you doing out here without your cloak? You'll freeze or worse, catch a cold again and be in bed for a week. How will your father keep up with business in the inn with you lying abed?" Melisende unfastened her own cloak and wrapped it around the girl's shoulders. "There. That should help." Jella's eyes grew wide, shining in the moonlight. "Oh no, Lady Melisende, this cloak is far too fine for me. I couldn't." Melisende's hand clamped over Jella's frozen fingers, stilling them, before she tied the cloak at the girl's throat. "Return it to the castle when you are done with it then. I have others." She reached into her bag and drew out a plain brown one that had once belonged to her brothers. They'd all outgrown it, with their broad shoulders, but it fit her just fine. "Now what are you doing out here? Are you coming up to the castle to fetch me? Is someone sick?" Jella shook her head. "Father sent me up to the watchtower with a message for Uncle Beatus. He said to stay up there until the army leaves. They're bad men, my lady. You should not be out here. It isn't safe." She darted a glance behind her. Melisende heard it too. "Horses. Must be men from the army. Quick, hide, my lady." Jella ran into the trees beside the road, blundering about until she half fell into a bush. Hoofbeats approached, accompanied by bawdy calls from the riders. No, these were not the kind of men she wanted to meet. These were crusaders with souls so deeply steeped in sin, they were desperate for redemption. God help the Holy Land if these were the best they could send. That's where she came in, wasn't it? To lend the army a small mite of virtue, so that this grand undertaking might win. She had no choice but to go with them, no matter what her father said. Melisende bit her lip, and began to run again.